Hi again, and welcome to the Talkingbass podcast. This week, I'm sitting down to talk bass with one of the greatest bass players of modern prog rock, Colin Edwin. Colin Edwin is most well known as bass player in Porcupine Tree, one of the biggest prog bands of the last 30 years that split up in 2010. He's also played with Henry Fool, Tim Bowness, O.R.k, and released 4 of his own solo albums, including his latest 2020 release, Infinite Regress. In this interview, Colin gives us an insight into his musical background and jazz influences, as well as his interest in odd time signatures, playing with Gavin Harrison, and much more. So without further ado, here's the great Colin Edwin. Hello and welcome to another Talkingbass podcast, and we're here with Colin Edwin, progressive rock master.
Hey Mark.
How you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good, all good.
Yeah, how's it been with all this? It's been a bit of a weird year.
I do a lot of recording, remotely. That's become the norm. So I've been able to do that, of course. Quite a few collaborations and sort of, anonymous sessions and things like that. But of course, no gigs, like everybody else. And very difficult to know where to go with stuff because, I've got a few ongoing projects and things, but, they usually rely on being able to go and play live at some point. And at this moment, there's no roadmap. There's no... there's no plan for how things are going to restart again. So, of course, it's very difficult to plan a tour. I'm supposed to be touring Europe next year. It's going to be next year. But, nobody really knows. It's a leap of faith for the promoters and for everybody else. So we just have to see,
Was that with your solo stuff or was that with O.R.k?
It's O.R.k, yeah. I'm happy to say we've just finalised a release date for the next record. So,
right.
That's going to be November, early November. That's quite good. We've been working on the record the whole time in lockdown, and actually we more or less scrapped what we had and restarted it again. So,
right,
there's a lot of stuff left over. But anyway, it's that's nice to have something firm. Which is good. So, but it does rely on doing gigs, anything like that to build an audience. So we'll have to see. Fingers crossed, we can make it happen.
Yeah, you had a solo album out last year as well, didn't you? Was that during the COVID thing, or was that just before Infinite Regress?
Yeah, that was just before. That was actually just before. So, yeah, I mean, I've been working, I like to do stuff with other people, but I like to just, do things on my own just to see what I get up to without any interference or without any, well, it's just a different mental exercise and it's good for creativity reasons to put yourself in the situation where you're making all the decisions.
Yeah.
So that was something that came out of that. And of course, I've been doing a bit more of that in lockdown as well, just sort of Bandcamp things, but that's kept me going as well,
Yeah. Well, I'm quite interested to find a little bit more about how you got started, actually, because your style of playing is not what a lot of people would consider, let's say, progressive metal in that sense, in that kind of style of playing. You've got very much it's more in the kind of Tony Levin kind of almost funky jazzy kind of vibe. It's very rhythmic, very melodic as well, with a lot of the grooves that you create, and it's kind of bouncy and bubbly in that kind of funky way as well, which for that kind of style, a lot of the stuff that you do is more in the progressive rock and the ambient sort of soundscapey kind of stuff, and it's got a very definite vibe. And it's one thing, I mean, for anybody that doesn't know about this, you're probably most famous for Porcupine Tree, so A lot of the albums that you did with Porcupine Tree, people will always point at people like Gavin's drumming on the later albums and Stephen's sort of, well, what he does, and the bass playing, even though on first hearing it's not an obvious thing that's coming out in that same way. When you listen to a lot of your solo stuff and the other stuff that you've done since, it's that theme that runs through it. You can tell it's such a distinctive part of that Porcupine Tree sound. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because I know you've got a bit of a jazz background as well. Do you think that's where a lot of that comes from?
I did come from a very musical family, and my father played a lot of jazz guitar. So we had, when I was growing up, there was music going on in the house all day long, and it was lots and lots of different things. But I can remember my father encouraged me in that sort of direction, because he was of the generation that was sort of pre-rock music, if you like. And
Yeah.
I think he hated all rock music, really. He just thought it was a load of nonsense, and things like there was a sort of cut-off point in a lot of older music lovers. I've noticed that the sort of big band jazz lovers and stuff, they didn't get rock music at all, and I don't think my dad did at all. My mum did, but my dad didn't. Apart from things like Santana, that I think he latched onto for the sort of Latin element that he could relate to. He thought most rock music was just sort of overly simplistic and dressed up nonsense, So I can remember listening when I was really young to a lot of things like Oscar Peterson and Joe Pass and Jim Hall, a lot of the guitarists as well. So that was all. It was it becomes part of your makeup, whether you know it or not. And when I expressed a desire to play music, I don't know how this happened, but he phoned up a guy called Jeff Klein, who's one of the top jazz bass players in Britain, really. He's amazing guy. And he just must have looked in the sort of Musicians Union directory and thought, oh, I've heard of him. I don't know. But Jeff was really open-minded bass player. And I had a couple of lessons with him, but I didn't really know anything about jazz. And it wasn't really, I'd heard it, but it wasn't really something I was interested in, as a listener. So, I wasn't really ready for it at that time, but at the same time, through meeting Jeff Klein, and he was really encouraging and a really good teacher. Well, I say a really good teacher. He wasn't a formal kind of teacher. His was more sort of explaining things in a very in a way that would lead you into curiosity rather than. Oh, hang on. I better get rid of that. It was a way of just leading you in a curiosity sort of led way. But he had a beautiful sound on the double bass, and I remember going around his house and hearing that, and that fired me up, although I didn't get a double bass for years later. So the jazz thing, I sort of learnt to play sort of a few standards and walking bass lines and things like that, which I would never have done because I wasn't interested in that really. But it all comes out in the mix in the end, even if you don't know it. So I learnt to improvise, and I learnt to sort of think on my feet. And the first sort of paying gigs that I had were sort of playing standards and things like that. So I guess that did filter through eventually. And then later on, years later, I got a genuine interest in jazz and stuff like that, But I didn't know any different at first. It was just a way that I was led into. That kind of I probably would never have gone down initially. I just wanted to play in a band with my mates at school, like a lot of other people.
Yeah. What kind of stuff were you playing in those bands at first? Was it just like standard sort of like rock stuff?
Yeah, well, I think I did a jazz course, and my first paying gig was actually with a drummer that I'd met on this jazz course, and it was like a party or something, playing sort of blues standards and jazz and that sort of the thing about jazz and having a shared repertoire is that when you learn a few tunes, you get asked to do another gig, and usually you find there's a lot of the same tunes. So you can one thing leads to another sort of quite quickly, and especially if you can play if you can follow a chord chart, which I could just about do, you're able to sort of fulfill a role that's quite in demand, or it was, at the time. There were people sort of, finding a jazz bass player was quite difficult in some respects. So I was able to sort of kind of earn a few pennies, doing gigs and things, which was great. That sort of kicked me off, and that meant that I could see it as being a sort of viable career in a way. It wasn't really at the time, but you can sort of see a path. So I did a lot of sort of pickup gigs and scratch gigs with just all sorts of people, and then I got into a regular gigging sort of blues band, which is kind of similar in a way, even though it was rock covers and Hendrix covers and things like that. There was a crossover with the sort of blues thing, and learning to play a walking bass line and fill a particular role in the music. But I wasn't really a big blues fan or anything like that. It was a way of just keeping me out of the 9 to 5. To be honest, it was just a gig, really. But everything, experience is always valuable. So Porcupine Tree was years after all that, really. But there were elements of improvisation, particularly with the early iteration of the band. The sort of more psychedelic era, if you like. So it all came in handy. All of that experience, for sure.
What kind of influences did you have from the rock end? Was it more from the progressive kind of side of things?
Well, funnily enough, no, I wasn't really a big listener of. I'm still not a big listener of Yes or Genesis or any of those things. That sort of, given I grew up in the 80s, at that time it had all been and gone, and it was seen as something very much from the past. So my sort of early influences really was a lot of the late punk stuff, and things like the Smiths and things like that. So I loved Magazine, for example, great bass player, Barry Adamson's really upfront bass playing, and things like the Police as well, the kind of reggae rock stuff that was going on in the late 70s, early 80s. I loved all that, and things like the Ruts and so it's interesting because that era, the 80s, the bass playing was really up front on a lot of records, so everything from the Police to Level 42 or the Paul Young records with Pino Palladino on, the bass was really often quite a featured sort of instrument, and had a prominence that it sort of lost in the 90s, I think. There was people like Flea later on, but it wasn't, if you listen to Oasis, the bass lines of, the biggest band of the 90s, arguably, the bass playing was very, very backseat kind of, it wasn't a feature, it wasn't exciting in the same way, I don't think. But anyway, that was the era that I grew up in, so all the sort of pop records, even if I didn't like them, you were sort of aware of the bass,
Yeah. It's a good point, that, because people always think of, the 60s and 70s as being these kind of golden eras for like bass playing, the Jameson thing and then and all the stuff that came after it. When in fact, the 80s was quite a golden era in terms of, it, like you say, everything was up front, and even in the very sort of what you would call standard pop bands, like even something like, I don't know, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran, things like that. There was a lot of upfront bass lines that were quite intricate a lot of the time. Even if it was seen as being quite basic, it was never like, you've got the Jacko thing and all the fusion stuff. But that was like on Level 42, obviously. But it didn't even have to be a lot of slapping stuff. A lot of it was, like you say, just out front.
Yeah. I mean, things like Gang of Four, I was listening to the other day. The bass lines they're not technically difficult, but they're a real feature for the music. They're like, everything hangs on it, and Talking Heads and things like that, as well. Yeah, there's loads of stuff. But yeah, I suppose I absorbed all that as well. So I don't know, where your style comes from. I did my homework as well. I did the Standing in the Shadows of Motown book and things like that. And but I wasn't. No, to answer the original question, I wasn't a big listener of prog rock. You bar a few things. I loved Gong. I don't know if you know Gong. Mike Howlett, fantastic bass player on those records, and I did go through a bit of a Magma phase, which is quite an interesting band for anyone that doesn't know them. I mean, I saw them live, and I sort of didn't like it. It's really intense music, but it's always dragged me back. There's something about it that's really compelling, and they've had a succession of amazing bass players as well. French Philippe Buissonnet, I think, is the guy who's been doing it for a long time. But there was Yannick Top, and I got to meet them. We played in America with them some years ago, and seeing them was incredible. They're all amazing musicians. But yeah, that the more standard sort of prog rock wasn't really on my radar. It was something that was mentioned to me by a lot of people. And people would talk about it, and but I didn't really have any Yes records or Genesis records or any of that stuff, apart from Peter Gabriel.
Well, there's a few bands like that kind of get lumped kind of into the prog thing. Like one of my favorite bands is Cardiacs, and they're kind of lumped into that realm as well, even though it's not progressive in the because there's that stereotypical, there's Yes, Genesis, all of that kind of thing that came out in the 70s. But then afterwards, there were a lot of these kind of almost punky kind of different, and like you were saying about things like Gong that are like, they're kind of just different, and it kind of occupies that psychedelic kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's Cardiacs were amazing, actually. They were really fun as well. They had that kind of zany thing going on. It was kind of mad, and they were completely in their own world. But yeah, they had. I guess they combined a lot of things in a way that nobody had done before. Yeah, fantastic stuff.
Yeah, and it all makes sense now, actually. Like I was saying earlier on about that kind of Tony Levin-ish kind of thing that you have, where you have that kind of bouncy, kind of upfront kind of thing. Because I didn't really think of it as being stereotypically prog either. It was, and now you say that about all the 80s thing, it makes a lot more sense. Because I'm thinking more, like you get stuff like that with Peter Gabriel and that later, but the later Peter Gabriel stuff is not what you would call prog or anything, even though it came from the Genesis background.
Yeah. I wore out Peter Gabriel 4, actually, which is interesting because I didn't go any further back or any further forward with his records, but I love that one for some reason. And Tony Levin's playing is amazing. I mean, years later, I did some gigs with a singer called Tim Bowness, and Tony Levin had played on his album. So I was thinking, it's going to be a bit of a challenge playing some of Tony's lines. But then I realised that he played to the music's very minimal. It's not kind of anything up front or tricky or difficult, but his lines were sort of perfect. There was nothing wasted. Everything was in its place, and it fit the music beautifully, and I couldn't improve on it, really. It was just like what it was. It was just as it was. So that was a really good lesson as well, just understanding that you can do just enough and it'll be right, But I think with a lot of the Tony's one of the most recorded bass players in history,
Yeah.
And I think that's something that he's got down, being able to fit what he does and make it all work, that's a big part of it. It's not to do with technique or chops or anything. He has a great sound, and then he fits the context that he plays in really, really well. So that's another thing I've taken from somebody like him, understanding that, I guess.
Yeah. You said about working through the Jameson book as well. Are you a reader in that sense?
Yeah. I do. I read music. I practice reading music. That's really been an important thing. And actually, writing down stuff. And I got in a situation, especially the last 10 years, of playing with lots of people and having to do a lot of preparation for just a few gigs, and then I wouldn't get asked to do it again for another 2 years or something. So I got into the habit of writing everything down, because you just forget, especially if you're not doing loads and loads of gigs. And that's really saved my hide, quite a few times. In fact, the first time I played with Tim Bowness, it was a bit of a funny one, because we were going to Ukraine, and I knew that he had a bass player on a few songs in his set. We were doing I was playing with my duo with Jeff Lee, XY's Heads, and
Mhm.
Tim had a band with a couple of guys from Estonia, and the bass was only in about 4 or 5 songs. So I said to him, look, just to make it a bit easier, rather than Pete, who plays usually, coming and doing 4 songs, I'll just do the songs, and then A, will save a bit of money, and it's easier. There's less hotel room, less flight, all the rest of it. So I wrote down the 3 or 4 songs that we were going to play, and actually on the day of the gig, it was a chaos situation where the sound engineer couldn't get it together to have me, and it was basically me and Jeff. So it's laptop, bass, and flute. And then the other setup was like a 4-piece band with a vocalist, sort of keyboards, guitar, trumpet. It's really, really basic. There's nothing complicated about it. No drum kit. And the engineer in this little theatre was just a disaster. He couldn't do it, So there was no sound check, no rehearsal, nothing. But I'd written it all out. So,
Right.
so the first time we actually played together was like in front of an audience, But yeah, that's the importance of writing stuff down. There you go.
When you with all the Porcupine Tree stuff, what was the writing process with that? Because obviously Stephen Wilson is kind of seen as being very much a kind of a composer in that sense. But with all the band stuff that you did, was it very much a band writing thing?
Well, there was a combination of things. So sometimes he would have quite a highly developed demo with the specific parts, but not always. Often, your job in a situation, I still see it this way: when somebody brings you a song or a piece of music, and even if they've got a written part or a demo bass line or a MIDI part, it's your job to sort of bring it to life. You're not necessarily going to slavishly follow, you're going to get the vibe of it, and maybe you'll learn what's there. And sometimes, if it's riff based, like a rock thing with a riff, you can't really deviate too much, or it's not a good idea to deviate too much, but you still want to try and bring some character to it, or bring it to life, or make it breathe a bit, or cut things out, So even when there was a highly developed demo, there was always space to develop the parts, or maybe because Gavin or Chris maybe would have approached the drum part differently to what the demo was, And then at other times it would be quite open. We would always have group jam sessions, if you like, writing sessions where we would come up with the basis of stuff that would be developed later. And sometimes there would be sections in a tune where maybe there was an idea, but there was no meat on the skeleton. It was kind of like, oh, this bit is kind of an ambient section and it's sort of D minor, but we might do this, and then you're coming up with an idea for how to develop a section. So yeah, it wasn't like in a lot of bands where the singer turns up with an acoustic guitar and everyone builds around it in that sense, But there was quite a bit of freedom and also quite a bit of opportunity for each of us, Richard and Gavin or Chris and myself to sort of flesh out what was there, And I think you can hear some of the original demos now on the reissues that have come out, and you'll hear how things have changed, or maybe they haven't necessarily changed, but they've been played in a more meaningful way, or they've been given a bit more kind of focus, if you like. So yeah, everything. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not precious about putting my own personality on everything. I think it's important to respect what's there already, and to improve it if you can. And if you can't improve it, or you don't want to improve it, or it sounds great as it is, just that's fine. Just concentrate on getting a good performance, getting a good sound. Sometimes there isn't any space with the bass to do very much. You can do very, very simple, very straight bass parts, but they still have a very important function. So some of the very slow ballady type tunes, I'm just maybe playing 1 or 2 notes, and things like note length become really critical, having a good sound, having a solid sort of tone that everything might sit upon. And some people might say, "Oh, well, there's nothing to that," but there is actually if you think about it,
Yeah,
Even
completely.
hearing a slide or a small detail can really make a big difference to the part, and it can be too distracting sometimes if there's too much going on. So it's
Yeah.
that's when your ears, you're listening, and your sort of focus is in a different area than just perhaps technique or something else. But it's just as important to me.
Considering that you didn't have much of a prog influence, it because there's quite. I mean, there's not a vast amount of odd times in the Porcupine Tree stuff, but there's enough. There's a fair bit. And so, did you work on that kind of side of your playing separately, or was that something that you had an interest in separate from all of that?
Yeah, yeah. I was always fascinated by odd time signatures, and I can trace it back very specifically to there was an album called Ivo Papasov's Bulgarian Wedding Ensemble, which
Yeah, it's crazy.
you know it. Yeah, it's amazing. I think I got it out of the library or something, or somebody played it to me, and it was just mad. And I was really fascinated by it because it was like nothing. I mean, pre-internet, you would. I used to go in the library, with friends of mine, and we get things out almost for a laugh, and listen to them.
Yeah, I did that.
But somebody played me this record, and it was because first thing is I couldn't understand anything about it. It was really fast. There was no rhythmic thing I could latch onto. And then I understood. It sounded like they were all really drunk, or something. It still
Probably were.
They probably were, the Slivovitz. But
Yeah.
I was fascinated by that, and then I started. Somebody played me Take Five, of course, and I remember thinking, oh, hang on, that's not. Wow, what's going on there? It's a 3 and a 2 or whatever, And then I really got into that, and then I was quite happy when that kind of came out in the music in Porcupine Tree. I had the opportunity to play some weird time signatures, and it's always been interesting to me, that odd rhythmic stuff, because it can really groove at times, but you wouldn't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's always going to be some kind of. It's almost like it's almost like Latin in that sense. It's almost like a clave, I think, that you get with a lot of the odd time signatures. When you like even something like dun 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 dun, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's still, even though that's 5, it's still 4 hits, and you kind of hear the hits, and yeah, it's so interesting that you didn't have that coming from prog, considering like. Genesis and that are doing so much stuff in those odd time signatures, and it all came from, the Bulgarian thing.
That was the first time I was aware of it, but then being a Gong fan, I did listen to, there's a track called The Isle of Everywhere on their third album, I think which is like a cycle, and it goes from 4 to 7 to 6 and then back again. And I understood that as well, and it has this feeling that it's because it's losing a quaver every time. It feels like it's speeding up as it goes through the cycle. It's quite a clever little composition. So there were things that I started to pick out in the music that I liked and the music that I was listening to, and then, but yeah, one of the first things I did when I got a sampler was I got the same sort of James Brown loops that everybody else has, but I tried to chop them up in sort of 5 or 7 or something weird, or 9, just to kind of see if I could come up with something different.
Yeah, adding quavers and taking them off just to
that's right. Yeah,
mess around. Yeah. Well, obviously, when Gavin joined, there was a little bit of a shift in the way that the band kind of sounded at that point, and I'm guessing that rhythmically he was. Well, hard to play along with. It's probably the wrong word. It's probably incredibly easy to play along with. But did you find... I mean, how was Gavin to play with in that sense?
Well, he fit in very, very quickly. In a way, his style was kind of similar to Chris Maitland in that they're both very busy sort of drummers.
Yeah.
So there's always a bit of... whereas a lot of drummers will be happy playing a beat and think about that. They're both, Chris and Gavin, are very into sort of flourishing things and playing fills and And Gavin specifically had a lot of ideas about what he called the rhythmic illusion, which
Yeah.
is where when you play a 4/4 beat, for example, basic example would be, you hear boom, chak, boom, chak. So your brain will always hear that as 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you displace that by a 16th, either early or late, then that
Yeah.
2 and 4 is not where you think it is.
No.
So he would occasionally throw in, a couple of bars like that, and it can be really disorientating. So I did have to work quite a bit on my sense of time. He's got a very, very, very accurate sense of time, Gavin. So that was something that became obvious. I was going to have to kind of get the metronome out and
Did you
do all
know that what? Well, when he did that, the first time that he ever did any rhythmic displacement on the, in the band, were you aware that he was doing that, or did you just think he'd messed up?
Oh no! I knew actually no, because I knew him a long time before he was in the band. I knew of him. We got a mutual friend. I hadn't played with him, but I knew him. And then also, he'd written one of his books by that point, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Chris actually had it. And I think we talked about it because he didn't know Gavin, but he knew that I knew him. So we must have had a conversation about it. So I knew that was something that he was likely to do.
Right.
So yeah, he's interesting ideas. It's like odd groupings of things. Where you can
Yeah.
take a couple of bars of 4/4 and chop them up into groups of 7 and 5. So you have this odd odd time sort of thing, but it's not really odd time because it all breaks down to 4. It's all those kind of ideas. That's his thing, really.
Yeah, I've noticed that quite a bit with some of when I've been transcribing or listening to some of that stuff, and a lot of it still happens in some of Stephen's later solo stuff as well, where you get like 4 bars or 2 bars where you've got 16 beats maybe, or depending on which the subdivision, and then it's like divided up like 5, 5 and a 6, or a 4 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5, and but it still adds up to 4/4 in the long run.
Yeah. Well, it's quite interesting because you can take something that you think you're familiar with and make it really unfamiliar and make it really, really strange, So it's quite an interesting idea. There's a lot in a little, in a way. You take a bar of 4/4, and the first thing you can do is chop it up into a 5 and a 3 or something,
Yeah.
and it will feel different, to just feeling 1, 2, 3, 4. So always love those kind of ideas,
Yeah. Yeah, because even fairly normal numbers like 6 and 9 can end up feeling kind of odd, because 6 is like a 4 and a 2, instead of having the typical 3 and a 3 for the compound time. But like that 4 and a 2 as a 6 always sounds almost like an odd time signature to me. It always feels like there's an odd 2 in there.
No, I'm fascinated with it. More recently, and perhaps a little bit less known, I did some Ukrainian folk music. I met a couple of singers from Kiev when I played in Kiev, and I was fascinated. First of all, 2 female vocalists who sing these really interesting harmonies, which we're not used to. Very close sort of harmonies, very unusual sound.
Yeah.
But a lot of the folk music, I don't know anything about the folk music, but I was asked to do some stuff with them, and the first piece they sent me. Well, the first thing was I remember listening to. They just sent me a vocal track, and I listened to it, and I thought, "Wow, the voices are really powerful and really fascinating to my ear." But it was impenetrable. I couldn't work it out at all. So I wrote back to them and I said, "Did you record it to a click track?" And they said, "Yeah." And they gave me the tempo, and then it made sense. But the actual phrasing of the vocal line was 7/6/6/7.
Right, okay.
But it's got a very definite pulse, so it doesn't feel too weird. And it's a traditional folk song. And we made a couple of records. I made a couple of records, firstly with the duo and then with just one of the singers. And it's all based on their traditional Slavic folk music. But there's a lot of stuff where they sing a phrase, and the phrase will be 6 beats long, and then the next phrase will be 4 beats long. And it all makes sense when you hear it. So it's very natural to them, and they don't really think about it like that, But the very first time I did a gig with them in Ukraine, they had a local drummer who was great actually, but I don't think he realised that it was what the beat cycle was the first time we did this particular tune, and it was a
Mm.
complete train wreck when we rehearsed it. And I had to sit, and it didn't occur to me. I had to sit down and explain it to him. No, it's like 7/6/6, and then it all made sense, you know. But it's fascinating, you know. That's just part of their culture. It's every day. We're so used to 4/4 and 6/8 and 3/4.
Mm.
This is traditional folk music that's been around for centuries. A lot of the time, you know, people singing it in villages and stuff, and it's dead weird, you know. It's dead,
Yeah.
you know, it's dead weird to us, but to them, it's just, you know, like a nursery rhyme. It's totally natural.
But they can dance to it, can't they? I mean, it's like that Bulgarian wedding music. It's just crazy. You got like 11, 16 and that, and they can dance to it because they know the phrase.
Yeah, there's dances to it. There's a when I checked it out more recently, a bit of Ivo Papasov, and there's footage of him playing some quite. It looks like a town square or something, and there's a band, and they're playing, and there's loads of people there listening to this band, and it's like weird because they're all really obviously enjoying it and understanding it. But I watched it and I thought it's like seeing something really, really hard to understand, but everyone else is getting it. You know what I mean? It's like that funny.
Yeah,
It's like going to a comedy show where you don't understand the language and everyone's laughing. You know, they all
yeah,
get it and you don't. It's really funny. It's funny to watch that.
yeah. It's crazy, but they obviously have it ingrained into them from an early age. They just know because they won't be counting it in that same sense. They probably just
Right.
feel it as a certain pulse, you know, a certain
Yeah,
rhythm.
it can become natural. I mean, I also, with O.R.k, the guitarist, Carmelo, he's got a Sicilian heritage. And every now and again, he comes out with things that are really quite odd. You know, he's very much a sort of rock guitar player, but
Yeah,
he's coming from a different angle. He's grown up with this, I guess, the traditional Sicilian music, hearing that around him as a kid, and then later on he's got into Soundgarden. But you know, so he come out with things every now and again that are like, well, hang on, what did you do there? You know, and he doesn't really think about it. It's just like, oh, and then you break it down, and he's done a bar of 3 and a bar of 7, but if
yeah.
you ask him to count it, he'll get annoyed about it, and he doesn't want to know. He won't count. He won't think about it intellectually. It's just there, you know.
Probably messed up if he tried counting it while he was doing it.
Yeah, yeah. He doesn't like it. We did a track with a click track like that, and I thought I would help him out, and I did a voice cue, you know, and everything, and he didn't like it. He just turned it off. He didn't want to think about it. He just played it. It was fine.
Yeah. Well, your solo stuff it still has that kind of what's the word, like an ambient kind of proggy kind of vibe going on with with that kind of bass bounce that I was talking about. What's your compositional process with that stuff? Is it very different from how you approached all the Porcupine Tree stuff?
Well, usually I just have an idea that I like, a basic idea. I mean, actually, I'm a bit of I call it sketching. I'll just come up with, you know, I'll take a drum loop or a riff idea or something that appeals to me, or, you know, a chord or anything. And I'll just sort of play around with it until I can find
Mm,
an idea that I think's got a bit of merit. And
mm,
then if I'm in a situation where I'm working with somebody else, you know, I might present it to them and we'll develop it together and it'll be a whatever. And if it doesn't make it that far, I'll just try and develop it myself, you know.
mm.
So there isn't really a sort of set process, but it all comes out of basically, well, you know, messing about, I suppose, you know.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
messing about is an important part of creativity, I think, you know. Um, it's kind of hard to define because I think when you're actively trying to come up with something, it's very difficult. When you allow yourself to just sort of to not think about it too much, and just not worry about the end result, it would be, you know, it usually ends up being a lot better for me
Mm,
anyway.
yeah.
Um, I think initially as well, being a bass player, it's difficult to do stuff on your own, you know,
Mm,
because you're very much part of being you know, being in a group or being in a duo or having other musicians. Most of the time, what you do relies on supporting other people,
yeah.
um, and being fulfilling a role in the band, of filling out the bottom end and making everybody else feel comfortable. And so when you're on your own, it's like, well, what do I do? There's no drummer, there's no there's no one sort of to fire off with.
Yeah.
But I found I was trying to come up with more ideas with Porcupine Tree. A lot of the time, we'd all come to the writing sessions, the group writing sessions, with very small snippets of ideas. It didn't have to be anything complicated. It would be just a 2-bar loop, or Richard might have a couple of just few chords, and that was always, I found that when we did get together, that was always the most productive place to start from. If anybody had anything that was overly complicated or overly thought out, then it was harder to develop, Whereas when it was just a basic thing, we all usually found our way with it quite quickly. So I took the same approach myself, just taking small things and developing them and not worrying about the end result. And I would, usually work on a few different ideas at the same time, and I'd give up with them as soon as they got boring, or as soon as they started to feel like a chore. I'd just leave it, walk away from it, come back to it a couple of days later, and I'd usually find I could come up with the next thing, the next part, or the next idea, So almost taking away the result, taking away the desire for any kind of result, made it enjoyable for one thing, but also more productive, which you wouldn't think would be the case, but that's definitely how it works with me. It's better not to have a result in mind, in that circumstance.
Yeah. What basses are you using these days?
Well, I still use my wall basses quite a lot. I find they seem to fit almost everything. They're very sort of, I don't know, they've got character, but you tend to find they can fit a lot of different contexts. And, it's an interesting instrument because it's an 80s instrument, really. They're vintage now, aren't they? But
they are, aren't they? Yeah.
The number of different people that play them as well. It's not just jazz players or rock players. There's all sorts of different people playing them. So they're really versatile, I think. Yeah. So I still use my wall basses. I've got a really nice Spectre fretless, a USA one that they made for me about 10 years ago that I use a lot. And then
I heard that on the solo stuff. You use that quite a bit on there, don't you?
Yeah, and also actually, funnily enough, with Twinscapes, which is this project I got with a marvelous Italian bass player, Lorenzo Feliciati, we've settled on a sort of. Well, it's interesting. He goes through loads of different basses. Every time we get together, he's got some fretted 5-string, or whatever he's got, a headless thing or something different. I've more or less found that every time we play together, I would just stick to the fretless. And it seems to fit. He does a fretted thing and I do a fretless thing. It always seems to work, but there's not too much discussion about it. But that's a lovely bass. It's really expressive, very melodic, got a really nice swell to the note, and also an even response all over the neck, which is really important. And also that kind of thing about the even response, it's quite hard sometimes, to find a bass like that. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's got like one string miles louder than the other.
Yeah. Have you got any fretted Spectres as well?
I have, yeah. I've got a couple of Euro 4.3. They call it 435. 435 LX is the designation, because it's 4-string with a 35-inch scale. That's where the 3.5 comes from.
Oh, right.
And LX, I think, means longer. I don't know, L for long, but they're a slightly longer scale length. So I have one specifically set up for like the bottom 4 of a 5-string, which I used in Porcupine Tree quite a bit on some of the heavier numbers. Stephen got into down tuning to a C, and on a couple of the tunes I wanted to do get the almost kind of cement mixer sort of low end.
Yeah.
And it's like when you hit a piano on the low strings, it has that sort of quality. The notes very tight and defined and clear, and I just like playing them. They're really well made, solid instruments, mostly
Did you
net
use a heavier
string.
gauge for that tuning, for the lower tuning?
Yeah, just like the bottom four of a 5 string.
Oh, so you used the gauges of the so you used the B
Exactly.
string on there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I sometimes tune it, from a C upwards, CF, and then sometimes from a B upwards. Just depends on what I'm playing. I did play it
I never thought to do
exclusively.
that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it makes you play slightly differently.
Mm.
I did a band for a while called O.R.k, which is very heavy, doomy, down-tuned thing, and the guitarist Araldo Bonocchi was using a baritone guitar. So I needed to sort of get underneath that, and have a bit more definition. So I found it was great for that sort of context as well, it's not a fast instrument. It's a judgment instrument. You need to play long notes and be defined with it. I found most of the time. But yeah, I enjoy that as well. I'd much rather play that than a 5 string, really. I enjoyed that part of it, but that was a specific context I was using it in most of the time. And with some of the Porcupine Tree songs as well, it'd be the sort of more the heavier stuff usually. Some of the heavier
You've
stuff.
got my brain ticking now. Because I've never. I mean, it must be something that people do. I've just never seen anybody do it. But I'm now thinking I'm going to get one of my 5 string packs there and stick it on my 4 string. That sounds really cool because I like the fact that that bottom string, if you've only tuned it to C and it's a B string, it's normally a B string. It's going to be tighter anyway
Yeah.
when you tune it up. So yeah, it's. You've got things, cogs are turning.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I found it was good for anything where you want like a low note but a lot of definition. I did try a couple of 5 strings, but I was never that comfortable with them. I didn't really like the. I didn't really. I suppose I got too used to 4 at that point. I've got one
Yeah.
now. I've got a Rob Allen. I don't know if you know them. The
Yeah, yeah.
really, really nice instrument. In fact, I didn't want a 5 string, but I couldn't find a 4 string in this country. It took a lot of searching. I went to New York with the band years when we first started going there, and I went into a music shop called Sam Ash, and
Yeah.
I was knocked out with this Rob Allen, but I just didn't have the money to buy it, and I just bought a house, and my wife. I know if I bought it home, I'd be getting divorced.
Yeah.
So, to much regret, I didn't buy it, and it was years and years later I managed to track one down in this country, and I bought it off a guy who clearly didn't want to sell it, but needed the money. But
Yeah.
it's a really nice instrument. It's a bit of a one-trick pony, but it genuinely is. It's almost like a synth in a way. It's got a very defined low end, just a piezo pickup, and it's not quite an upright bass, but it does have it's close, for some things it's close. It's nice to have that option.
What scale is it?
I think that's a 35-inch scale as well, actually. I think
Right.
so. Yeah, it doesn't feel too different because of where they put the bridge. It's quite near the end of the body. With the Spectres, it does feel like you're going out further. I'm reaching my arm over to show you.
Yeah, yeah.
It does feel like you're going a bit further out. But yeah, I think that's a 35-inch scale as well. I might be wrong. I haven't checked that spec for a while.
Yeah, I'm not a big 5 string fan, even though I've had to play them when I've done like theatre gigs and stuff like that, where you've got to read stuff where somebody's written it down and, some
Yeah,
keyboard player wrote it and so it's going to be down
yeah,
low
yeah.
or if anything gets transposed. But because I spent so long on 4 string, sometimes I wish I'd have started on 5 string, to be honest, because then I'd probably feel more natural with it. But if I've given a choice, I'd rather play 4, which is why that idea of having the that B string on that bottom, or I suppose you'd call it a C string, wouldn't you? Putting that on sounds wicked.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can recommend the 435, the Euro Spectres. They're not too
Yeah.
expensive. I think they're made in the Czech Republic, rather than the sort of Spectre have got like levels of. I think they do a Korean model, which is a cheaper version, and then there's
Mm.
the European series, and then of course the USA versions are sort of the top spec, if you like. But yeah, they're all, from what I can tell, they're all really, really well made, and the quality control is very good. They've been very solid instruments I've been able to travel with, and one of the things about touring is having them in a freezing cold van and then going into a hot gig night after night, and I've never had any trouble with them. In that respect, they're very solid, very well made. So yeah, I can recommend them.
What amps do you generally use?
Well, I had a long relationship with EBS, so
Right.
I've got a few different EBS amps. I've got a Fafner, the big valve one.
Yeah.
I've got the TD. I'm not very good with the titles, but the 361. And then just more recently, I've got one of the smaller. I can't remember what it's called because it's been in the case for a year. But it's the smaller valve head with the sort of little red light on it. And yeah, I like EBS stuff. I like the pedals as well. A lot of interesting, well-made pedals. They do good sounds on them too.
Do you use many pedals when you go out on the road?
Yeah, I do actually. I do like. I mean, a lot of the time I'm just focused on getting a straight bass sound. So for me, effects are usually like salt and pepper. A little bit here and there, and you can. If you slam the octave pedal on at the right time, you're really going to ramp things up. It's that sort of idea. But most of the time, I'm not using a lot of effects, except with Twinscapes, with the thing I talked about earlier with Lorenzo. It was a great context to use things that I've got an interest in, but that I'm not usually able to use. So delay effects. I do a lot of EBO stuff, with that.
I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. We did a gig once in London, and there's just the two of us and Roberto on drums, and the sound engineer was going, "Who's playing keyboards?" there's no keyboard player, because Lorenzo's got this way of making swells and ambient sounds with a volume pedal and a delay unit. And I realised that I would do pretty much the same thing as him, but I'm using an EBO and a delay, and so we can create these big soundscapes with basses, but it doesn't really sound like a bass when you hear it on the records. You might be thinking there's a keyboard player or it's a sample or something, but it's all done, with the bass.
Yeah, I'd never really up until I'd heard an EBO, but it was we did an interview with Michael Manring last week, and of course he uses EBOs quite a lot. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, "That is it?" Because it's kind of supposedly supposed to give that sound of like a bowed instrument, but it doesn't really, does it? It just sounds more like a synth.
Yeah, you can treat the EBO as well, so you can run the pedal through whatever, the sound through distortion or whatever you want to do as well, and you can really change it. But it's good for those sort of ambient, atmospheric, washy things, and it's a kind of a haunting sound, sometimes to me, especially on the fretless, Everybody's, I still have the same problem as everybody else. You pick it up occasionally and you go to the string and nothing happens because it's super critical where the magnet starts to make the string vibrate. So it can be a bit frustrating, especially live. You get to a point where you got to play something and then, oh, hang on, there's this millimeter sweet spot, but it's never put me off. I'd still try and do it all the time,
Cool. All right then, Colin. That was great. I've learned quite a bit about you there. Loads of stuff that I had no idea about.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it.